Τώρα, κυρίες και κύριοι, θα παρακολουθήσουμε την συζήτηση που κάναμε πριν από λίγες ώρες με τον Τίμοθι Γκάρτον Ας, τον Βρετανό ιστορικό του Πανεπιστημίου της Οξφόρδης. Νομίζω θα την βρείτε ιδιαίτερα ενδιαφέρουσα. Ραντεβού την επόμενη Πέμπτη με τον Επίλογο. Να είστε καλά. Καλό σας βράδυ. Professor Garton Ash, thank you very much for being with us tonight. In your recent book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, you kind of describe the history of Europe through your own lens, through your own stories. In a way, I would like to ask you, what is the notion of Europe for the average European person, you think? It's different from every aspect?
So there's one thing we all have in common, which is the unique feature of being a European, is that you can feel at home abroad. So I'm in Athens today, yesterday I was in Tirana, before that in Stockholm, in Copenhagen, in Paris, in Madrid. In every case you're abroad, but you're also at home. Hence the title of the book, Patrides, Homelands. And that for me is, I think, the unique feature of being a European. Poor old Americans only have one homeland, as in homeland security. We have many.
And you point that into your book. You say that back in the 50s or the 60s, that was not an option for the average European,
Absolutely.
or maybe for the 19th century, not even for the richest persons in the continent. But over the course of the last 40 and 50 years, the whole thing has changed.
Completely. I mean, when I was a boy, foreign countries, even France, was incredibly remote. It was like sort of going to the moon or something. Now, almost all Europeans have personal experience of other countries in Europe. So it's a lived experience of other places. You know, I think a lot of young Europeans take this for granted. They think it's normal. It's not normal. In historical perspective, it's profoundly abnormal.
In a sense, it's strange because here in Greece, many times we say the Europeans do it that way. Or I imagine in Britain, sometimes you say the Europeans behave that way.
I never say that because I'm an English European, but some of my compatriots do.
And this whole notion of we're a nation state and there are some other people, but we're kind of living in a joint European family. It has been cultivated through the years. You believe that there's a new generation of Europeans now that have a different feeling of what the olders would have?
Completely. You know, there was a famous statement after Italian unification, we've made Italy, now we need to make Italians. And I would say today it's almost the reverse with Europe. We've made Europeans, now we need to make Europe. And by the way, can I just say, because you mentioned Britain, you know, the largest pro-European demonstrations I have witnessed over the last 50 years have been in Kiev, in Ukraine, and in London to protest against Brexit. So there are a lot of people, Brits, who also feel deeply European.
Was one of the things that I was thinking of asking you over the course of this interview, but let me put this question right now straight. Is there any chance in the following decades that you see this Brexit ideology losing path in the UK and there's a reverse trend for Britain to somehow rejoin the European Union in the future?
I hope very much I'll live to see it. So we have passed peak Brexit. That is now clear. Even this Conservative government is making small steps back towards Europe. Then next year, we'll probably get a government under Keir Starmer. There will be more steps to come closer to the European Union. I would say at the end of the 2020s, if the European Union is doing really well and looks very attractive, and Britain not doing so well, the question of rejoining will be closed. And so in a sense, it's up to you, the members of the EU. You make the EU look really great again, and then maybe Britain will rejoin.
You know, 7 years after, why do you think Brexit won?
So many people on the continent regard this as somehow inevitable. One of the themes of the book is that nothing is inevitable. Not the good news, like the fall of the Berlin Wall or the end of the Cold War. That was a 1 in a million example of historical luck. Yeah, it could so easily have gone wrong. And equally, the bad things are not inevitable. So it was very close, 52% to 48%. if we'd had a different leader of the Labour Party, if Boris Johnson had jumped the other way, if one of 5 different factors had happened differently, it would have gone the other way. So it really was, that's how history really happens. It wasn't inevitable. But of course, the consequences are going to be played out for a long, long time. And for me personally, as a lifelong English European, you know, it is the biggest political defeat of my life.
You mentioned the Berlin Wall, and you have written extensively about 1989, that era that you have lived as a young professor around Europe. Do you recall these days of optimism, and what do you think went wrong, and the days of optimism were followed by days of anger, of division, of resentment in the continent?
So first of all, let's remember, when I started traveling around continental Europe as a very young man 50 years ago, early 1970s, most Europeans lived under dictatorships. Not just the whole of Eastern Europe, but Greece, Spain, Portugal. And starting with the end of the dictatorships in this country and Spain and Portugal, we have this great advance, this spread of freedom, and to those extraordinary days of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And before, you know, let me tell you a story about that moment. It's a day after the Berlin Wall has come down. I'm walking across the death strip, where 2 days before you would have been shot for trying to cross. I get into East Berlin, and an East Berliner comes towards me and he tells me he's just seen an improvised poster which says, "Only today is the war really over." And I think it's profoundly true for half of Europe. Only in 1989 was the war really over. 2 years later, I'm sitting opposite Helmut Kohl in his office in Berlin. Helmut Kohl has just unified Germany. Did you ever see Helmut Kohl?
Not personally.
Okay. Helmut Kohl was the largest human being I have ever seen. An enormous man, both in height and in girth. He's towering over me in his office in Bonn, and suddenly he says, "The professor, do you realize you're sitting opposite the direct successor to Adolf Hitler?" Somewhat shocking thing to say, but the reason...
Because all the other chancellors that followed Hitler were chancellors of West Germany and not the, the unified country, right?
Exactly. Now listen, if I'd actually been quick enough, what I should have said is, actually, Herr Bundeskanzler, there was Grand Admiral Dönitz between Hitler and you, but I was much too gobsmacked to say anything at all. But of course, he was making a very serious point, which was, I'm so conscious of my historical responsibility. I'm the first Chancellor of United Germany since Adolf Hitler. Hitler tried to put a German roof over Europe. I'm going to put a European roof over Germany, and so to drive forward European unification. So that gives you a sense of that time, that everyone was conscious of the historical dimensions of that period. And I would say, I know you had my friend Francis Fukuyama on your show. People always say, oh, Fukuyama, end of history, liberal triumphalism. You know what? It wasn't the 1990s. Actually, we got a hell of a lot right. We made the transitions to democracy across Eastern Europe. We enlarged the European Union. Only 6 member states in 1972, 27 by 2007. I would say it was in the early to mid-2000s that we became complacent, we became lazy, we became self-satisfied, or to use the Greek word, hubris. The hubris set in. And to your question, I think it was the hubris of liberal Europe in the 2000s.
Just because you mentioned Helmut Kohl, and I've read your book, and you have also encountered encounters with Margaret Thatcher and François Mitterrand. There's something that differentiates the leaders of that era to the leaders of today. Maybe they were, their generation had experienced World War II, and had some other kind of thoughts in their minds, maybe talking with history in some sense. I would like to ask your take on what differentiates that generation of leaders to today's leaders in Europe.
So I think it's a great question. I argue that today's Europe, which with all its faults, and even with a big war going on in Ukraine, is still the best Europe we've ever had. Let's be clear about that. Is the product of 4 generations. The 14ers, who were shaped by their experience as young men and women by the First World War, the 39ers, Second World War, you know this very well in Greece, the 68ers, and the 89ers, those who experienced 1989 as young men and women. And each of those generations had this kind of formative experience in their youth, which produced what I call the memory engine, right? It drove them forward. So Helmut Kohl, even though he was a child at the end of the war, was absolutely driven by the experience of the Second World War. De Gaulle, Winston Churchill by the First World War. And now for the first time, we have a generation of Europeans and European leaders who don't have any of these formative experiences, who for the most part have just known a Europe that was fairly prosperous, fairly free, pretty much at peace. So the question is, can they mobilize to defend this Europe which is so much under threat? Or will we have a generation of 22ers, those shaped by this experience of 2022, the fact that we have the largest war in Europe since 1945, and now next door we have another big war, Israel-Hamas.
You point the 2 wars that are on the doorsteps of Europe, the war in Ukraine, and of course the situation in the Middle East, which is deteriorating day by day. And the question here is, how do you see Europe reacting to those crises as a whole, as an actor in international affairs?
Yeah, so first of all, when I started writing this book, I could see that things were going wrong in Europe. We had the Eurozone crisis, we had the refugee crisis, we had Brexit, we had Trump, we had populism. I never imagined that we would have something like the Second World War going on just next door. So the chronologically last chapter of the book is going to Ukraine, talking to wounded soldiers, seeing what's going on there. In my view, Europe has reacted well to the war in Ukraine. You know, there's this mechanism identified by the historian Arnold Toynbee, challenge and response, and we responded strongly with unity to supporting Ukraine, and very weakly to the war in the Middle East, Israel-Hamas. Europe at the moment is all over the place, utterly divided on it. Mm-hmm. So geopolitical Europe, yes, confronted with Ukraine, not in sight at the moment in relation to Israel-Hamas, plus the fact that because our countries have large Jewish and Muslim populations, this is now a domestic issue. Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as just a foreign policy. It's not a war over there. It's also something in our own societies. I mean, one of the big changes over the last 50 years is that our societies now have people from everywhere. And if you have people from everywhere in your society, then anything that happens anywhere is also a domestic event.
Mm-hmm. Based on your experience, how do you see the whole crisis in the Middle East evolving?
Well, I mean, I should say I'm not a Middle East specialist, mm-hmm. but there is clearly a serious danger that it could spread, that you could get Iran involved. The United States is already much more directly involved than we are. Any answer on that has to start with saying the immediate cause is Hamas. Hamas with this absolutely brutal, terrible terrorist attack. Hamas taking hostages. Hamas using civilians as shields. That said, we as Europeans have to be consistent in standing up for international humanitarian law and the laws of war. Mm-hmm. Because the rest of the world is watching us and saying, you're preaching to us about the bombing of civilians in Ukraine. What are you going to say about Gaza? So the 2 wars influence each other as well.
And what about the other theater of operations, the war in Ukraine? It's already been 18 months so far. How do you see that evolving?
So 3 weeks ago, I was talking to wounded soldiers from the front in a military hospital in Lviv. Men without legs, without arm, without feet because of the Russian minefields. They were telling me just how difficult it is to make any military progress at all. These huge minefields, 3 lines of Russian defense. So it's going badly militarily for Ukraine. They're having great difficulty winning back territory. And on the other hand, US support for Ukraine was already dwindling. Donald Trump would be a disaster for Ukraine. The new Speaker of the House of Representatives is trying to withhold funding for Ukraine. And now the Israel-Hamas war will be a higher priority for the United States, competing for diplomatic attention, funding, and weapons. Conclusion, if you take those 2 things together, you know, as those wounded soldiers were telling me, it's going badly, diminishing US support. We in Europe need to do more. If we in Europe don't do more, I'm afraid Vladimir Putin will hang on to nearly 1/5 of Ukraine. By the way, a territory roughly the size of Greece.
Yeah, point taken, yeah.
And then that will be a huge defeat, not just for Ukraine, it'll be a defeat for Europe and the West. And Vladimir Putin will be able to declare victory.
And based on the scenario you just referred to, if Donald Trump gets elected next year, November of 2024, what would that mean for Europe?
First of all, I don't know whether the probability is 25% or 35% or 40%, but there's a very significant probability.
Even if it's 25%, it is a possibility, right?
It's
a scenario on the table.
It's a very significant possibility because Trump commands a Republican candidate. He will be commands the Republican Party. He will be the candidate, and amazingly, all these lawsuits don't seem to be working against him. And against him, he has a Joe Biden who is very old and looking rather frail. I would say we in Europe have to prepare for President Trump 2.0. What does that mean? It means we in Europe still have enormous soft power. We're immensely attractive. Ironically enough, that's part of our problem, because that's why so many people want to come across the Mediterranean or the Adriatic to be with us. We don't have enough hard power, both economic and military power. So I think we should already be working, because of Ukraine, because of Israel-Hamas, because of Xi Jinping, but also because of the prospect of Trump 2.0, to build up our hard power.
Before we get to the November 2024 elections in the US, we have European elections in 2024 in June. And there is a widespread fear that the right-wing parties might claim some victories in various countries. And according to all the polls, they might end up as the 3rd party power in the European Parliament. Does that worry you?
Very much. I think you've identified the biggest danger. I'm beginning to fear that 2023 may be a new 2015. A year in which what I call civilizational panic about mass migration drives our politics to the nationalist, populist, xenophobic right. So I obviously write in the book a lot about 2015 and 2016, what happened then, and it's happening again. So what we need to do to prevent that happening is, first of all, to reassure our publics that migration is under control. The Brexit slogan, "Take back control," was a brilliant slogan. I hate it, but it was brilliant.
Yeah, it convinced a lot of people.
It absolutely captured this feeling. It's not necessarily the scale of immigration, it's that it's not under control. Now, if you look at German politics, President Steinmeier, former President Gauck are talking about Kontrollverlust, the loss of control. It's the same thing. So we have to give our citizens a sense that it's under control. It has to be humane and legal, which is not always the case, as you know very well. There have been cases of people being pushed back. And then the people who do come to us have then to be integrated into our societies. Those are the 3 conditions. And we've got to do that in the next 9 months to give people a sense of that. Otherwise, you will have a big victory for the nationalist right, populist right, and they won't leave the EU like the Brits, who were so foolish as to leave. They will wrench the European Union to the right.
And in case we have any Islamistic terrorism incidents in Europe over the next 9 months, you can understand how difficult it will be for the liberal parties to somehow win over the elections.
Absolutely, because of course populists are playing on, be it Marine Le Pen or the AfD, which is doing extremely well in Germany, or Vox, are playing on civilizational panic. As I say in the book, the crude equation, immigrant Muslim terrorist, right? And that's very effective. So we need mainstream liberal conservative, liberal left politicians to convey a message of calm, but also we've got this under control.
The rise of populism in Europe, is it only due to migration, or is it also the social injustice that we see widespread in the European societies that actually feeds
Absolutely. So,
populism?
I mean, let me be very clear. The Eurozone crisis plays a significant role in this story, in the downward turn. And I think what happened to Greece was absolutely terrible. I mean, I describe an encounter with Wolfgang Schäuble, a name well known to you, in which a Greek economist said to him, in my presence at Oxford at the height of the Eurozone crisis, "You've got the economics wrong, right? You're driving a downward spiral in the Greek economy." And amazingly, Wolfgang Schäuble said, "I don't really believe in economics. I believe in law and political will." So I think what happened to Greece was really terrible and unnecessary and avoidable. And by the way, one of several mistakes of Angela Merkel. The broader point is, part of our liberal hubris was that we paid so much attention to the other half of the world and not enough attention to the other half of our own societies. And the other half of our own societies, which felt not just economically discriminated, but also culturally ignored, disrespected, they turned to the populists.
I mean, I can understand that when you visit Greece, you might say that after all that this country has been through, the fact that we're still up and running is a miracle for most of the Europeans, right?
Absolutely. I vividly remember coming to Athens in 2015 and this sense of absolutely existential crisis.
It was intense. It was really cruel for most of the people.
Absolutely. And
the whole country was divided.
I mean, the sheer suffering. I mean, I write in the book about the suicides, the terrible human suffering, one in particular, which was unnecessary, which was genuinely unnecessary. So the recovery has been amazing, but the suffering was cruel.
Right. Finally, you have portrayed 70 years of European history in a book. You have lived around Europe, you have traveled a lot. If I were to ask you what is an optimistic scenario for the next 70 years, and what is a pessimistic scenario for Europe?
70.
70 years, yes.
That's a great, well, of course, historians aren't prophets.
That's why I give you two options, meaning what is the optimistic scenario of deeper integration, I guess, and what is the less optimistic scenario?
So, let's not kid ourselves. We face enormous global challenges. The population of the world has doubled in the last 50 years. The planet has warmed by 0.5 degrees in the last 50 years, more than in the 11,000 years from the end of the Ice Age to 1900. We have wars around the edge of our continent, and we have lots of non-Western great powers, China, India, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, asserting themselves. So the external environment is really challenging, much more so than in 1989. Against that, we have the biggest and best European Union we've ever had, and now we're entering a new phase of enlargement. Pessimistic scenario, we don't address those global challenges. Instead of our model spreading to our neighborhood, all the problems of the world come to us. You already see it in Serbia, in Hungary. Optimistic, we build a larger, stronger European Union which is capable of defending our interests and our values in the wider world. My formula, after Antonio Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Thank you very much, Professor Garton Ash, for being with us tonight.
Great pleasure.